First of all, an apology, I have to run out, as Jeremy said, as soon as I finish this lecture. Secondly, because of the introductory and roundabout character of my first lecture, I will not be on schedule and not get to 1917 in this lecture. The strictly historical part of this lecture will only reach 1905, or rather more exactly, it will cover the years 1903 through 1907. So, in preparing myself for this lecture, I encountered an obstacle. I had, I think, all this in mind when I suggested these lectures to Chris, the image of Trotsky, the lone survivor of the shipwreck of socialism, bravely battling on adrift a raft called Trotskyism in the storm-tossed seas of mid-20th century politics. I imagined the old man, as his young disciples called him. Although he was only 60 when he was murdered, he seemed to them much older than that, because they felt that he belonged not only to their present, but also to a previous era. In looking at this previous era of pre-World War I social democracy and Trotsky's role, the necessary temptation is always to look forward 30 years and see the themes of the later period foreshadowed in the earlier. Trotsky, the prophet of permanent revolution, or the thick cliche that the revolution of 1905 was the dress rehearsal for 1917. So at the same time that I felt the gravitational pull of 1905, of its separateness, as well as the anticipation of the later, more admittedly more world historical moment. Can everyone hear me? The central theme of these lectures is generally Trotsky and Trotskyism, but in this lecture we are not yet there. Trotsky, but not Trotskyism. Although the term Trotskyism was actually used in this period when Milyukov attacked the revolutionary illusions of Trotskyism in 1906, clearly Trotskyism, in the sense that I am concerned with, could not have existed. Trotsky in this period was simply a particularly talented social democrat whose ideas functioned within the framework of pre-World War I international social democracy. Along with Lenin and Luxemburg, he represented the best traditions of this world. Trotsky, unlike Lenin and Luxemburg, though, would survive into the world of mid-century totalitarianisms. To many young radicals of the 1930s, Trotsky in exile would come to seem an almost mythical figure. For them, as I said, the world of 1905 seemed impossibly distant, as distant perhaps as their world of the 1930s seems to us, although it was, of course, immensely closer in actual years. And I actually met at the very end of their lives some of the people who had become Trotskyists in the 1930s. So I have this feel of a direct personal connection to those people. So Trotsky in this later period, the period I mostly imagine him, then ends up to me reminding me of those gigantic Easter Island figures. What's visible hints at how much is buried. But it's a great shock then when it is revealed. It's so unnerving, all that those massive heads rest on. Perhaps as I thought, as I tried to dig out the body, that the heads sticking out of the ground alone were more beautiful. But the greatest difficulty I have, though, with this history is that it cannot be offered to you as useful. What we have then are problems, questions, and vignettes of worlds lost. In my previous lecture, I mentioned that dates could be abbreviations for ideas. The theme of this lecture is taken from Trotsky himself in Results and Prospects, whereas the very title of Chapter 3, he simply offers the three dates, 1789, 1848, 1905. Then he begins, history does not repeat itself. However much one may compare the Russian Revolution with the Great French Revolution, the former can never be transformed into a repetition of the latter. The 19th century has not passed in vain. This notion that the 19th century has not passed in vain is central to understanding both the greatness and limitations of Second International radicalism, which was the formative environment for not only Trotsky, but also Luxemburg and Lenin. The assertion that the 19th century has not passed in vain can unfortunately no longer be taken for granted today, as it was by Trotsky. We are faced with the very real possibility that the 19th century has in fact passed in vain, and that all the political achievements, one might even say spiritual achievements, of that great century have also indeed passed in vain. If this is the case, Marxism itself, the greatest product of the 19th century, has failed, And it may then be the case that not merely the 19th century, but all of human history has passed in vain. We will, for the moment, though, put aside such gloomy thoughts and instead try to think about how Trotsky and others writing in a more optimistic and intelligent era than our own conceived the history of that 19th century. So although Trotsky was writing in what chronologically was the beginning of the 20th century, from a standpoint of retrospect, we may take the 19th century he refers to have continued a little longer, until 1914 or perhaps 1917. For our purposes, and in this sense, Trotsky was speaking about the 19th century, can be taken, therefore, from the period from the Great French Revolution to the Great Russian Revolution, or at least to the First World War. 1905 has, of course, famously been taken to be the dress rehearsal for 1917, and we'll return to this theme in a bit. But 1905 is, in a particular sense, Trotsky's revolution. He played by far the largest role in it of any Russian social democrat. Lenin, for example, was essentially a bystander. Lenin, on the other hand, is clearly the central hero of 1917. Indeed, many people would wonder whether the Bolshevik Revolution would have happened at all if it had not been Lenin, although Trotsky's role was second only to Lenin's. So one may, without too much historical injustice, claim that 1917, the Greater Revolution, belongs to Lenin, and 1905 to Trotsky. 1917 became Trotsky's revolution too, but only because he joined Lenin. To the extent that Lenin in 1917, to a certain extent, became a Trotskyist also, it is because he embraced ideas of Trotsky's that flowed from his experiences in 1905. So when Marxists in the early 20th century, like Trotsky, imagined this long 19th century that he said had not passed in vain, they imagined this 19th century as the supreme flowering and subsequent decay of bourgeois civilization. The 20th century, they confidently imagined, would witness the collapse of this civilization and its replacement on a global scale, of course, with a new, higher, better, deeply democratic socialist civilization which would redeem all the unfulfilled promises of the great bourgeois revolutions. Even more than being its deadly antagonist, the socialist movement was envisioned as the heir of all that was the best in bourgeois civilization. Now, for most of us, even those of us eager to embrace this vision, we have problems with it. We know that bourgeois civilization did indeed collapse as anticipated, but it was replaced not by socialism, but rather with what seems more like barbarism. We have so deeply internalized the horrors of the 20th century that to inhabit the world of late 19th and early 20th century Marxism is almost as difficult for us as to inhabit the mental world of the people who built the great Gothic cathedrals. Almost, for unlike the world of the Middle Ages, the world of the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, Marxism is also our world in its fundamental structures. What has changed most is that we no longer have the confidence that we can fix it. We are traumatized by the 20th century. If the horrors of the 20th century are symbolized by Auschwitz, Hiroshima, and the Gulag, then each of these represents a betrayal of a central aspect of the faith of Second International Marxism. After Hiroshima, intelligent, non-obscurantist people can question whether scientific knowledge is worth having. The most fundamental principle of the Enlightenment, Kant's sapere aude, has been called into question. From the standpoint of the physicist, F equals ma and E equals mc squared. By the way, I kept thinking about Einstein because 1905 was also Einstein's Annus Mirabilis, so E equals mc squared dates from 1905. It's also the year of Freud's 3 essays on sexuality, to give you a sense of the cultural context. That's not merely the political context. So from the scientist standpoint, F equals ma and E equals mc squared are merely two equations, with the latter more exactly describing the material world than the former. But of course, from the standpoint of humanity, they're radically different, since the latter entails the possibility of the extinction of the human species in a perhaps quite near future. But this is a social and historical fact, though not a scientific one. In the 19th century, people, still unclear as to the source of the sun's energy, worried about the sun growing cold in a few million years. Now that we know the source of the sun's energy, we know that the sun will be fine for a few billion years, and instead we have to worry that we humans, having mastered the source of the sun's energy, will use the thousands of H-bombs we've built in the next few decades or years. How terrible the irony. If Hiroshima calls into question, though, the value of science and the mastery of nature, then Auschwitz calls into question the value of civilization itself. How absurd it now seems to speak of medieval torture or the Dark Ages. The dungeons and persecutions of the 20th century as much surpass those of the Middle Ages as modern engineering does medieval. The Germany of the Ottonian emperors seems a bastion of enlightenment compared to that of Adolf Hitler. Every assumption the liberalism of the 19th century made about European bourgeois civilization was shown to be a lie in the mid-20th. Finally, the Gulag calls into question perhaps the most painful point of all. Auschwitz and Hiroshima showed the barbarism latent in bourgeois civilization. So while late 19th and early 20th century Marxists certainly never anticipated just how bad things would become, the more prescient of them certainly understood the danger that a postponed socialist revolution might pose for humanity. Socialism or barbarism. But the Gulag seemed to suggest that there might be a barbarism latent in socialism too. This last and most painful question to a socialist is in fact the central point of these lectures. Was it possible, we have to ask, that not only socialism or barbarism, but also socialism and barbarism? So to address these questions, we must first of all tackle the question of optimism and our own fear of it. I remember reading many years ago a classic history of the Jews by the 19th century German Jewish historian Gratz, and finding quaint his 19th century liberal indignation at the atrocities carried out by crusaders against the Jews of the Rhineland. Had he only known what would happen to the Jews of Germany and Europe in the 20th century, I thought. But later I realized that my sense of Gratz's quaintness was itself a problem, a symptom of the moral desensitization of 20th century barbarism. So we must, if we are to take Trotsky seriously, put ourselves in the frame of mind of an earlier moment and consider seriously the possibilities that Hiroshima, Auschwitz, and the Gulag represented setbacks, horrible setbacks, but not the end of the story, and that ultimately the 19th century progressive narrative might triumph, not inevitably, but that it might. Is this possible? Can we even think this way? It seems so difficult. So Nicholas Krasow, in his interesting, but I think deeply wrong-headed piece on Trotsky's Marxism, says quite revealingly in criticizing Trotsky that Trotsky himself spoke frequently of revolutionary optimism in later years. But, continues Krasow, optimism and pessimism are, of course, emotional attitudes which have little to do with Marxism. Bourgeois Weltanschauung has traditionally weltered in such categories. The adjective revolutionary does not make optimism a more profound category than the adjective heroic ever made pessimism. That revolutionary optimism is here connected by Krasow with heroic pessimism, both implicitly derided as bourgeois, in contrast to a supposedly scientific and unemotional Marxism, speaks deeply of the Stalinist attitudes of Krasow. By contrast, Platypus is perhaps unique on the left today in tracing its lineage back to both revolutionary optimism and heroic pessimism, or represented somewhat schematically as types by Trotsky, i.e. revolutionary optimism, and Adorno, heroic pessimism. Somewhat of a simplification, but. For Platypus, unlike Krasow, not only embraces both revolutionary optimism and heroic pessimism, but senses their inner unity and their dual necessity for any possible future left. To return now to the notion we began with, that the 19th century has not passed in vain. What is meant by this, and how are we to interpret these 3 days? For each day stands for an inflection point in the history of the left. But before we deal with another larger aspect of the meaning of the 19th century. So, the 19th century vastly expanded the scope of history. Whereas before the 19th century, little was known of the ancient world except for the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome and ancient Israel, the 19th century began the rediscovery of the great civilizations of the ancient Near East. Furthermore, beyond this written history, it opened up the entire scope of prehistory. And beyond this, Darwin rendered the whole living world historical with his theory of evolution. The character of historical writing changed too. On one side, it became more scientific, but in another way, it also absorbed the lesson from the Romantics that each era had its own particular character of genius. It was the particular gift of the 19th century to recognize so well the genius and character of preceding centuries. Hitherto, historians had only been able to see in the past little more than a mirror of the present. What characterized the 19th century, what distinguished it from all previous centuries, was this anxious awareness of history itself. For the first time, educated men and women began to take for granted the idea that all aspects of human life had a history, that the past was different from the present, and that the future would also be different. Whereas before continuity had been taken for granted, now discontinuity came to the fore. It was obvious to nearly everyone not only that history mattered, but that history had accelerated. To what end it was heading was unclear, but that it had speeded up was obvious. In the age of railroads, not only did people move faster, so did history. So let's again pause to notice this foreshortening. It's central to the imagination of this generation of Marxists. The intensification of the awareness of history and its acceleration go hand in hand. For millions of years, life had been blindly evolving until one particular clever featherless biped appeared. A very clever tool-making ape. Long eras of savagery eventually gave way to barbarism and finally civilization. For thousands of years, civilization had, for all of its glamour, consisted really of just the exploitation of the mass of humanity by small elites. Then a few hundred years ago, a new class, the bourgeoisie, had arisen out of decaying feudalism. And as it gradually grew stronger, new horizons had opened for humanity. For this new class, while also exploitative, changed the nature of human history. The new civilization, capitalism, that it brought forth, unlike all previous social forms, offered the possibility of being replaced by a civilized society, not based, as hitherto, on exploitation and domination. Previously, one form of unfreedom and domination had merely been able to give way to other forms of unfreedom and domination. Indeed, one could say that even though the bourgeoisie could not fulfill the promise of its own ideas, that it was the bourgeoisie itself that had invented freedom. A new and hitherto unrecognized possibility, a genuine novum, existed for humanity. Freedom not for some, but for all. Now consider again, if you will, how foreshortened this rule of the bourgeoisie is to be, how remarkably brief. For how many centuries had feudal elites dominated Europe? Almost a millennium. But how long was the rule of the bourgeoisie expected to be? At most a century. So fatal was the contradiction bourgeois civilization contained within itself, these Marxists thought, and so accelerated had due to the bourgeoisie itself history it become. So this is the first arc that Trotsky traces by these three dates, 1789, 1848, 1905, the crisis of the bourgeoisie and the civilization it had created. It's as though almost in the instant of wresting power from the old feudal classes, the historic mission of the bourgeoisie is done. As soon as society has become fully bourgeois, the bourgeoisie becomes superfluous and the day of the proletariat begins to dawn. But it's also an arc that bends eastward, France, Germany, Russia. Ex oriente lux. For as one moves forward in time and eastward in space, one encounters a bourgeoisie steadily more cautious, more cowardly, and a proletariat steadily more ready to take its place as the necessary agent of history. It was Trotsky's prescience, and also Parvis's, credit where credit is due, that he drew a conclusion that hardly any other Marxist dared to draw, at least not explicitly, that the proletariat would need to take into its own hands the historic tasks of the bourgeoisie. This has been the source of endless polemics about Trotskyism, pro and con. But let us here note something else, which is that it carries forward to its logical conclusion this sense of the foreshortening of history. If even in the advanced, deeply bourgeois West, the rule of the bourgeoisie is to be so short, a century or so, a few generations, a blink of an eye in terms of the history of humanity, in Russia, perhaps, it was not really to exist at all. What above all defines Russian history to Trotsky? Its miserableness, its backwardness, its lack of a truly bourgeois character like Western Europe. Even its feudalism was miserable compared to Western Europe. It lacked the Gothic lacework of Western civilization. The solution, however, is not to wait. And by the way, as I mentioned, sapere aude, which of course you'll be familiar with from Kant, Kant took that from Horace, and the original citation, the image, is of someone who waits at a stream expecting the stream to stop instead of crossing the stream. It's sort of like a Latin nakshon ben aminadav. So history will not recapitulate itself. The bourgeoisie will not in the 20th century Russia play the same role as in 18th century France. At the heart of Trotsky's insight is the thought that the mission civilisatrice of the bourgeoisie has now fallen to the proletariat. This notion, too, is one that grows organically out of the experience of social democracy in the late 19th century. In this respect, Results and Prospects is simultaneously a work that brilliantly anticipates 1917, and yet is firmly anchored in the world of pre-war social democracy, albeit on its left fringe. Well, let's not remain on this abstract plane, but rather examine in greater detail the actual political events in 1905 and the years leading up to it. So if 1905 looks forward to 1917, its causes take us back to 1861 with the emancipation of the serfs and the beginning of the Great Reforms. 3 times military defeat would be the catalyst for social transformation in Russia. Defeat in the Crimean War led to the abolition of serfdom. Defeat by Japan led to the Revolution of 1905 and the first attempts at a constitutional government. Finally, defeat in World War I led to the collapse of Tsarism and then the Bolshevik Revolution. In between each of these defeats, until the final collapse in 1917, Tsarism and the forces of order had reasserted themselves, however, and frustrated the profound change necessary for Russian society. In 1848, Russia had still been the gendarme of Europe, intervening, for example, against the Hungarian Revolution. But a few years later, when it faced the technologically superior Western powers of Britain and France, it was defeated in the Korean War, which led in a few years to the abolition of serfdom and the beginning of a period of liberalism in the 1860s. As the reforms of the 1860s stalled, a part of the intelligentsia turned to more radical approaches, and finally terrorism in the 1870s, which culminated with the assassination of the Tsar Liberator, as he was called, himself in 1881. A long period of reaction and political quiet set in. It was during this period that Lenin's brother, Alexander Ulyanov, was arrested and executed for a plot against the life of the Tsar in 1887, an event which would, of course, have profound psychological consequences for his younger brother. And then, in the 1890s, Russia finally began to industrialize. Under the ministries of Vishnegradsky and even more Witte, Russia began to experience a huge social transformation, which in turn led to the revival of political life. But in a new form now, a more European form. In the years around the beginning of the 20th century, a new Russia took shape in which nearly every political formation that would shape Russia over the next 20 years was established. So all these parties that you read about in the history of the Russian revolutions are cadets, social revolutionaries, social democrats, and after the 1903 split, Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. A new Russia of political parties had developed. This development had a paradoxical character, however. Russia was still an overwhelmingly rural and peasant country, but now it was a country of peasants and workers, of rural discontent in thousands of small villages spread over a huge area, and of militant strikes in gigantic factories. From 1906 on, Russia would have, as a result of the revolution of 1905, a constitution and parliament, the Duma, but they would have an obviously farcical character, and not even the most conciliatory liberal could have mistaken Russia for a constitutional monarchy. That is why in Russia, more than in any other country, liberalism often acquired a superficially radical and militant cast. The autocracy forced its militancy on it. The reason for these paradoxes is that capitalism had come to Russia particularly late and in a reformed manner. The reforms of the 1860s, in a certain sense, had represented a bourgeois revolution from above. In this respect, the country Russia most resembled was contemporary Meiji Japan. But while Meiji Japan seemed the more backward of the two in the 1860s, the reality was actually the opposite. In Japan, for reasons that go far back into the histories of the two countries, in which we can't go into, the roots of a genuine bourgeois society were actually much stronger, even as its technical development was lower, because of the long period of isolation of Japan. But by 1904, when war broke out, Japan showed that it had caught up. A century after the Meiji Restoration and the Great Reforms, Japan had become one of the pillars of the world capitalist order, and Russia, now the Soviet Union, appeared as its great antagonist. But all of these would have seemed quite fantastic developments to even the acutest observer of the 1860s. Meanwhile, in the West, after 1848, a new socio-political reality had also taken place. At the same time that the great reforms were taking place in Russia, the first political organizations of the German working class had been formed. The Lassallean Allgemeiner Deutsche Arbeiterverein in 1863 and the Marxist Sozialdemokratische Arbeiterpartei formed in 1869. And these were then to merge at a conference held in Gotha, of the Critique of the Gotha program in 1875, just at the same time that the Narodniks were going to the people. And just as the political development of Russia in the late 19th century was a response to 1861, and in Germany it was a response to 1848. In both countries, the bourgeoisie seemed to Marxists to have abandoned its historic role, but in each country in a different way. In 1848, the German bourgeoisie had seemed politically cowardly compared to the great heroic French bourgeoisie of 1789, but there could be no doubt about the triumphant development of German capitalism or the growth of the German proletariat. No one in Germany imagined that the future lay, say, with the German peasantry. If the German bourgeoisie had become complacent and was satisfied with a somewhat sham parliamentarism, and had embraced Bismarck's paternalism and Wilhelmine militarism, it was nevertheless comfortable in its retreat from politics. By contrast, in Russia, capitalism itself seemed an outgrowth of the needs of the state. There was, until 1906, no parliament, not even a sham one, and the autocracy seemed intent on ignoring the entire political development of the 19th century, which in the eyes of most Europeans, including an ever-increasing portion of educated Russians, rendered it a barbaric exception. Nor was the nature of Russian capitalism at all clear. At first, it seemed to many radical Russians that Russia could avoid capitalism as it manifested itself in Western Europe. The birth of Russian Marxism in the 1880s, whose founders were Axelrod and Plekhanov, both of whom were ex-Narodniks, was premised on the idea that Russia, however belatedly, must follow the European path and could not avoid capitalism. And then that led to the thought that it should, in fact, welcome it as laying the groundwork for a Marxist working class politics. But still, Russia could appear as capitalism could still appear as an alien import and not as in the West, something that had sort of organically developed. And for a long time, this Marxist embrace of the necessity of capitalism gave it, to many Russian radicals, a disarmingly conservative cast. A real Russian Marxist movement, like an organized Russian liberalism, would only begin around the turn of the century. But still, at the same time, the old Narodnik tradition hung on, even while it incorporated elements of both liberalism and more clearly Marxism. In a country as overwhelmingly peasant as Russia, the politics of Marxists who placed their hopes in the proletariat and liberals who placed it in the bourgeoisie both seemed to many to fetishize the small, albeit growing portion of the country that was urban at the expense of the rural majority. So this triangular tension among the three components of the anti-autocracy coalition would dominate Russian politics for a couple of decades and give it its peculiar character. In Germany, the conservative character of the Bismarckian resolution of the German question had in effect left the German Social Democrats, after the abdication of German liberals, as the only remaining heirs of the radical democratic tradition of 1848. In Russia, by contrast, the radical democratic tradition seemed split among these three camps. Liberalism had not yet had the opportunity to betray itself. There had been no Russian 1848 yet. So when Trotsky says that however much one may compare the Russian Revolution with the Great French Revolution, the former can never be transformed into a repetition of the latter, he's also implicitly thinking not only of the difference between 1905 and 1789, but also the potential analogy between 1848 and 1905. It was, however, 1848 with a difference. International social democracy had now developed, and Marxism was no longer an infant, but a mature ideology winning over steadily larger sections of the working class in both Russia and Western and Central Europe. So in 1903, as you'll already know, the Second Congress, but it was really the first because the first one in 1898 had not amounted to anything, of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party met in exile and split into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. So one of the central factors in deepening the split between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks in 1904 was how to respond to the liberal campaign against the government that began in late 1904 and preceded the workers' strikes of 1905. As one writer put it, one analogy was made later on was 1904 was the 1905, but 1788 was the 1789 French Revolution. Anyway, in November 1904, Iskra, which had by then come under Menshevik control, responded favorably to the Liberal Zemstvo Congress. Having acknowledged that the Liberals had taken the critical initiative, the Mensheviks contended that Social Democrats and workers should encourage the Liberals in their campaign for a constitution and should even participate in it. But, they said, Social Democrats must not adopt an excessively militant approach, for that would drive Liberals to the right. They should limit their demands to the election of a constituent assembly on the basis of universal, equal, direct, and secret suffrage. Although workers and Social Democrats should stage demonstrations wherever the Liberals were meeting and should seek to present their views to the bourgeois opposition, they must take every opportunity to avoid frightening the Liberals. Lenin immediately attacked the Menshevik scheme. The Mensheviks were admitting, he said, that the Liberals did not favor genuine democracy. How then could the bourgeois opposition be gently prodded to press for democratic reforms? Unlike the Mensheviks, Lenin no longer expected the bourgeoisie to play a progressive role. Bourgeois democracy, he stated, was by its nature not in the condition to satisfy these demands because it was unwilling to undermine in full the authority of the monarchy, the army, and the bureaucracy, and was by nature condemned to a series of half measures. The workers, instead of wasting their time trying to influence the bourgeoisie, should instead spend their time preparing for a national uprising. Now, if in this doubt about the future possibility of a progressive role of the bourgeoisie in Russia, Lenin and Trotsky were actually remarkably similar. And at least in theoretical terms, Trotsky's boldness actually exceeded that of Lenin. So that would be very much the point of an orthodox interpretation of 1905 to talk about the theory of permanent revolution, and that would stress that point. But the question remains, why did Trotsky distance himself from the Bolsheviks and dedicate some of his harshest and later most regretted polemics against Lenin? Now, both Lenin and Luxemburg significantly at this time saw Lenin as a Jacobin figure, a throwback to an earlier phase of revolutionary politics. In his essay, Social Democrat and Jacobin, Trotsky had outlined the difference he saw between these two historic phases of revolutionary politics. The Social Democrat and the Jacobin stand, Trotsky said, for two opposed worlds, doctrines, and mentalities. The Jacobins were utopians. We Social Democrats aspire to express the objective trend. They were idealists. We are materialists. They were rationalists. We are dialecticians. They chopped off heads. We enlightened them with class consciousness. He goes on. A Jacobin tribunal would have tried under the charge of moderation the whole international labor movement, and Marx's lion head would have been the first to roll under the guillotine. Robespierre used to say, I know only two parties, the good and the evil citizens, and this aphorism is engraved on the heart of Maximilian Lenin, whose malicious and morally repulsive suspiciousness is a flat caricature of the tragic Jacobin intolerance. Such statements are, of course, an embarrassment to Trotskyists who point out that Trotsky later repudiated them. For Stalinists and Social Democrats, they've served as fuel for different politics. To Stalinists, they have served to paint Trotsky as the enemy of Lenin, who simply later reverted to his true character. For Social Democrats and others, including some elements of the Trotskyist movement, perhaps, or quasi-Trotsky, they've made Trotsky into a sympathetic figure, on the other hand, whose later politics were the tragic error, i.e. the opposite judgment of Orthodox Trotskyism, that it was the period 1904 to 1917, which was his mistake. But what's striking here is the precise character of Trotsky's error. Trotsky sees Leninism as a reversion to radical bourgeois politics. It is, in his view, against the whole progress of the 19th century. In both his putting forward the theory of permanent revolution and his critique of Leninism, Trotsky imagines that he's offering critiques from the left. Of course, retrospectively, an orthodox perspective would say that Trotsky was more correct and to the left of Lenin on the question of the character of the coming Russian Revolution, and Lenin was correct on the question of the party, and to Trotsky's left on this issue. But we should ask, forgetting the subsequent history, why should Trotsky have seen these things at the time the way he did? What sense can we make of his error, which he admitted was an error, in its time? At issue here again is the vexing notion of what made a revolution bourgeois and what role this bourgeois aspect must play. I think somewhere in 1905 says that that the revolution would be bourgeois in its goals, but proletarian in its methods. I think that's a formula Trotsky uses. In 1905, Trotsky would put his faith in the spontaneity of the working masses against both Jacobinism, as he quite falsely imagined Leninism to be, and also saw these same masses as capable of pushing the revolution further along than a more timid orthodoxy, as manifested by the Mensheviks, still stuck in the notion of a necessarily bourgeois character held possible. So Lenin was closer to Trotsky on that than the Mensheviks, though Trotsky went further than any other social democrat except for Parvus. Later in 1917, Trotsky would accept Lenin's views on the party question unreservedly and never turn back. But the problem of Jacobinism would actually continue to haunt him. It might be that, as he said, however much one may compare the Russian Revolution with the Great French Revolution, the former can never be transformed into a repetition of the latter. Yet when later Trotsky would search for an explanation of Stalinism, the metaphor he came up with was, significantly, Thermidor. But if Stalinism was Thermidor, then uneluctably the Bolsheviks were analogous to the Jacobins. So was there then, in the end, a kind of repetition of 1789? This problem, in many ways, continues to haunt leftist discourse about the revolution of 1917. If the Soviet Union did not represent socialism, had the cunning of history merely found a new way of reproducing capital through its apparently most dedicated enemies? If the Bolshevik Revolution had not brought about, quote, socialism, unquote, then did the Bolsheviks perhaps represent a new species of bourgeois revolutionaries, a new kind of Jacobin. Nearly all left critiques, and by left critique I mean all those that claim to seek the abolition of capitalism, because of course there are lots of right critiques of the Bolshevik Revolution, stumble on this problem in one way or another. In our moment, the name Jacobin, you know that Bhaskar, of course, has acquired a new sort of resonance, and people like Zizek come to the defense of Robespierre, but as a fetishization of terror. For Trotsky and other radical social democrats of the pre-World War I era, the Jacobins were, though, a tragedy, one which luckily, so they assumed in their optimism that, quote, the 19th century had not passed in vain, they would not have to repeat. For Zizek, on the other hand, the Jacobin is a type and not an historic phenomenon, and the tragedy must be endlessly repeated. In fact, Zizek goes so far in his historic hopelessness that he describes Marx himself as the arch-purveyor of bourgeois thought. He says, Zizek says, Marx's notion of the communist society is itself the inherent capitalist fantasy. That is, it is a phantasmic scenario for resolving the capitalist antagonisms he so aptly described. Such comments would, of course, have seemed to any pre-World War I social democrat to be the incoherent ravings of a madman. One other feature of 1905 requires mention: the birth of the Soviet. The strange thing is that the Soviet, which was the genuine novum of 1905 and was to become so central to the claim for the legitimacy of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, did not immediately impress those whom one would think would have been most impressed. Remember that it would be in name, if not in fact alas, the Soviet Union. And nothing, in fact, illustrates better the internationalist character of the Bolshevik Revolution than the name change from Russian to Soviet, from ethnicity to political form. But in 1905, the Soviets did not necessarily seem as radical as they would later. The Bolsheviks, in fact, were rather ambivalent in 1905. One historian, Abraham Asher, writes, because the Petersburg Soviet assumed great authority during the general strike of 1905, and even more in 1917, social democratic activists have argued at length not only about its origins, but about the way it was viewed by revolutionary Marxists. Bolsheviks have been sensitive about the subject because in 1905, their party was extremely ambivalent about the new organization. Initially, the Bolsheviks favored the Soviet, but as soon as it assumed political leadership of the St. Petersburg proletariat, they became hostile towards it. They were uncomfortable with any organization that strove to be nonpartisan, believing that any such organ could not genuinely speak for proletarian interests. Only after Lenin arrived in St. Petersburg in November did the Bolsheviks desist from attacking the Soviet outright. But actually, Lenin himself distrusted the Soviet, also because of its nonpartisan stance. Though in 1940 a document came to light in which Lenin argued that the Soviet should represent various social classes and groups, and that it might turn into the nucleus of a future revolutionary government. However,
Can you pause for 1 second? Sorry, we're just having a feed problem. Okay, now you should be a little bit.
okay.
Sorry.
However, this expression of strong support for the Soviet was uncharacteristic of Lenin. In 1905, he took part in only a few sessions of the Executive Committee and made no significant contribution to its work. Moreover, in Moscow, where the Bolsheviks were stronger than the Mensheviks, a Soviet was not introduced until November 21st. On the other hand, the Mensheviks enthusiastically supported the Soviets, whose origins can in fact be traced to several ideas they had in 1905. For some months before the general strike, the Mensheviks had advocated the creation of organs of revolutionary self-government. In the summer of 1905, the Menshevik leader Axelrod had proposed the convocation of a workers' congress, which was to be based on working-class elections in factories and local districts. On October 10th, it was Mensheviks who issued a call for the election of deputies to a Soviet. All these proposals and activities were part of the larger plan to create a broad proletarian political party. The function of the Soviets would be to lead the working class into the social democratic movement and to help train cadres for the party. Once the Soviet in Petersburg came into existence, the Mensheviks, unlike the Bolsheviks, rallied behind it. And the leadership in the Soviet was in fact assumed by the Mensheviks. And this control of the Mensheviks is admitted even by the later official historiography of the USSR. So clearly then, the path from these Menshevik-dominated organs to the Bolsheviks demanding all power to the Soviets was by no means inevitable. All power to the Soviets in 1917, of course. An interesting anecdote is told, by the way, by Deutscher regarding Lenin's attitude towards Trotsky and his central role in the Petersburg Soviet. Lunacharsky recalled that when Lenin was told that the strong man in the Soviet is Trotsky, Lenin's face darkened somewhat. But then he said, well, Trotsky has earned it with his tireless work. Now, one short-term consequence of the revolution of 1905, and I think, by the way, the chapters in the Seymour are quite useful on this, was that many Mensheviks, particularly in Petersburg, fell under the influence of Trotsky's radicalism, and both the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks gained many new young recruits. And the Mensheviks were temporarily chastened in their faith in the liberal bourgeoisie. The split of 1903, and again, many of these were new recruits, seemed to many pointless, and negotiations were begun for reunification. And in 1906, there was, of course, the Fourth Reunification Congress. But in the long run, the result of 1905 would be actually to deepen the split between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks and show how untenable Trotsky had attempted to maintain independence from both factions was. And they finally split in 1912, of course, and never reunited. But many of the central questions posed by 1905 remained unclear, and no reconciliation between Trotsky and Lenin occurred until 1917. Now, in thinking about 1905, I've tried rather deliberately to avoid treating 1905 as merely the dress rehearsal for 1917. I think that that foreshortens in the wrong sort of sense its character. Rather, I've often been reminded of Ranke's maxim that jede Epoche ist unmittelbar zu Gott und der Wert beruht gar nicht auf dem, was aus ihr vorgeht, sondern in ihrer Existenz selbst. That every generation or every period is equidistant from God, and its value consists not in what necessarily stems from it, but in its own existence, which in Ranke's context is actually a statement of rather conservative historicism, I have to admit. But in this context, I'm focusing on not automatically thinking that 1905 led to 1917 and thinking about 1905 as a problem in itself. Now, whether in fact 1917 solved all the issues raised by 1905, such as the role of the party, the role of the Soviets, and the role of the bourgeoisie, may now actually be less clear to us than they seemed for many years after 1917, and as they remain to an orthodoxy up till now. But for now, these are questions to postpone for further lectures. And 1917, not 1905, is the central story. We are platypus 1917, of course, and that is where we are headed next. And now I'm afraid I have to go to catch a train.
Like Lenin to the Finland station.
Like Lenin to the Finland station.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, audiences abroad. I am going to close this off then. See you all next week at 1 p.m. Eastern, or 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central. Bye. So I don't know how people want to proceed. We could take an early break, or we could start talking now and take a break in a little bit. I guess I'm taking this over. This is a little bit of a surprise, but that's cool.
Where's he going? Just